I'm one of the co-owners of Politics and Prose. My co-owner and husband is over here, Brad Graham. He welcomes you as well, as does our terrific staff. Just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a cell phone on and wouldn't mind turning it off, that would be much appreciated. At the end of the event, if you could fold up your chairs and put them to the side, it will expedite the signing line, and it will also make our staff really happy at the end of a long day. So we would appreciate that. And the way this will work is that we will do a bit of conversation here. We will take audience questions about halfway through. There's a microphone right here. If you wouldn't mind trying to make your way to the mic if you have a question. We do film these events, and that way we capture the question on the video, which is nice for people who are watching it who weren't here. And I think that's it for my housekeeping. I just want to say that nothing gives a bookstore owner more pleasure than introducing and hosting a good friend for an author event. And even more so when that friend has written a timely, important, and spectacular book. So tonight you can imagine how thrilled I am, how delighted I am to be here in conversation with journalist, scholar, author, and friend, Kim Ghattas. She'll be talking with us about her new book. It's called Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. You can see it here. Isn't this a great cover, by the way? I love this cover. I know there was a lot of thought put into it. By way of background, Kim and I first met over a decade ago when I was a speechwriter for the Secretary Clinton, and Kim was covering the State Department and American politics and that sort of stuff for the BBC. And it wasn't hard watching her in action to see immediately the intelligence, the rigor, the intellectual depth and acuity, and also the judiciousness and thoughtfulness that she brought to her work. She also brought a rich perspective as someone who was born in the Middle East. She was born in Beirut, grew up in Beirut. And also someone who lives here part-time. So she brought a very worldly perspective to her work. From those experiences at State, she went on to write her first book. I don't know if any of you have read it, but if you have not, you should. It's called The Secretary. She describes it as her journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the heart of American power. It became a New York Times bestseller. And judging from the early and very laudatory reviews of Black Wave, I think you're going to be 2 for 2 in the bestseller sweepstakes. We certainly hope so. And by the way, just in case you missed it, she was also interviewed by Trevor Noah this week. Doesn't get much better than that. So that must have been a lot of fun.
It does. It's showing up at Politics and Prose.
Okay, see, well, I don't know about that. I don't think most people would agree with it, but thank you. And about her new book, Black Waves. In her career as a journalist with the BBC, she's also written for the Financial Times. She's contributed to The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and other publications. She has literally and metaphorically crossed all sorts of boundaries of all kinds. Her formative years were in Beirut, as I said. She's lived in parts of the Middle East and also here in Washington. She's witnessed, reported on, studied many of the events she covers in her book. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment. I meant to mention that. And she, of course, draws on her personal experiences as well. The question she sets out to answer, which you can read, I think, in the first line of the book, is what happened to us, meeting people who hail from the Middle East, as she does. How did the Middle East of the past, a land of poets and artists and thinkers and philosophers and diversity and pluralism, become the Middle East of today, a region, and I'm saying this carefully, characterized here in the West as a place of geopolitical rivalries, ruthless tyrants, stateless actors and proxies, and cataclysmic struggles over religion, culture, politics, oil, and money that reverberate around the world. To answer her question, Kim focuses on 7 countries and 40 years of recent history, many people and figures and characters that we all have heard of in the news, and many we have not. And the result is just to put it bluntly, it's a triumph of a book. It's a triumph of a piece of work. It beautifully weaves together events, people, and movements into a vivid, fascinating, and totally accessible narrative about a vexing, complicated part of the world. Now, to do justice to this book, we would need at least a week to talk about it, maybe a month, maybe a year. I'm just going to seize on a few general and a few specific things to ask him about. You will have a chance also, of course, to ask questions. I hope you will. I'm sure there are many. And I'm sure there are people in this audience who know far more about this subject than I do. So please feel free to come up and ask your questions if you have any. So I want to ask you the first question. So you've written about, in your first book, you wrote about diplomacy seen through the lens of somebody from another part of the world, from the Middle East. And now you're writing about a region you know very well, that is your homeland. And you have to sort of do it as an observer, but also presumably as somebody who has a deep caring, almost a personal stake in what happens there. So why this book and why now?
First of all, thank you so much for having me.
Love having you.
And thank you for the very generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's great to see all of you. And it's great to be back at Politics and Prose for my second book event. You know, when I started thinking about this book, it was 2014. It was before, Qasem Soleimani was in the news in the US. It was before the war in Syria had really degenerated into the paroxysm of horror that we see today. Yeah. It was before the war in Yemen. And somebody today, I was being interviewed on the BBC, asked me, how did you have the foresight, the clairvoyance to put this book out now? It was really just a question that I had used as a starting point, what happened to us. And the timing was very fortuitous in a way because I was ahead of the curve in a way, but I sort of felt that there was something to explore in that question of what happened to us. And the timing of the publication, it was really pure coincidence that it's coming out at this specific time when Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Middle East are so much in the news and these questions are being asked. There's a good reason sometimes why you miss your deadline is because the book is meant to come out at a different time, at a better time. So this book was supposed to come out in February of last year, but I missed my deadline a few times because it was quite the undertaking. I wanted to ask the question, what happened to us? And I wanted to write this story because there were several reasons why. I thought, first of all, that there were not enough books about the region in English written by people from the region in a way that was accessible to a wide audience. I thought there was a real gap there. I thought it was important for us in the Arab world to write our story and our narrative for ourselves and for a Western audience. And I also thought, thirdly, that it was important to explore the question of what happened to us, to try to understand from a local perspective, from a cultural perspective, a social perspective, what had happened and when it had started. When did we take a wrong turn? I know the question, what went wrong, has been asked a lot, and it's been asked by Westerners looking to the Middle East, and in some ways assuming or concluding that there is something intrinsically wrong with the region or the religion or the culture. And my starting point is very different. So I wanted to explore what had happened when we had gone wrong. And in the process of doing that, I came across this 1 year that was a fateful year that I found changed everything, and that's the year 1979.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that year in a minute. First, though, you mentioned you missed some deadlines, yes. And you were ahead of the curve. You were, others are saying you're clairvoyant. Whatever, you sort of hit the wave at the right time in terms of trying to explain this complicated story that is very much in the news. But doesn't that make it that much harder because things are changing so quickly, and it seems that it's a region where there's not a sort of predictable formula beyond a certain point. So I'm wondering, how on earth did you even go about writing this book? She covers 7 countries, 40 years, plus looking back, flashbacks to earlier times, enormous numbers of characters that you had to learn about to bring to life in this book. How did you go about that process?
So I got this question often. The first part of your question, which is, how do you do it when things are changing so fast? The good thing is that I was looking back. I was looking at the last 40 years, coming up all the way to today.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a moving target because I was looking at the history of the region. I was trying to decipher events in the past and see how they were connected and why they had led us to today. And so the book is a sort of sweeping history of the last 4 decades across 7 countries. And I weave in and out of these countries, and I use personal stories to explore the events in each one of these countries. So you travel through time and space. And it was very difficult to figure out how to put this into a coherent narrative, because you can't take your reader up and down, back and forth, and move countries. And there has to be a narrative arc. And the decades flow from each other. So there are specific events and specific trends that unfolded in each one of these decades, and very often also in a very specific country. So what I did is, first of all, it took me from 2014 until 2016 to really think through all the themes and all the different angles and to test my thesis. Was it really all about 1979? And was it really possible that no one had written about this before? Because there were books about Saudi Arabia, there were books about Iran, about the Iranian Revolution, or about Pakistan, or about Egypt, but I couldn't find one book that brought it all together, that connected all the pieces of the puzzle. There were books about 1979, but they were very limited in their exploration of the geopolitical events. And there was one book that was being worked on by a friend who was looking at the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but he was only looking at proxy wars and the Cold War and the use of militias. And I wanted to understand how the rivalry had altered cultures and societies and our understanding of religion. So what I did is, first of all, I tested the thesis repeatedly with experts and people who understand the region, who are in the region. I wrote a 70-page long proposal for the publisher, and then that got accepted. And then I set out over the course of 3 years to do the research and the travel and the writing. I had the help of 2 incredible research assistants in Beirut. And so I also decided to move back to Beirut to write this book, because I thought that I couldn't write it far away from the region. I needed to be immersed in the culture, the music, the mood, and not be distracted by President Trump.
That's hard.
It's
Probably
easier.
even in Beirut, that's hard.
It's easier when you're all the way in Beirut and then you're by the Mediterranean and etc. But what I did to put the pieces of this puzzle together is I created this huge matrix on my wall with on a cork board with index cards, where I had horizontally I had all the countries, and vertically I had all the decades. And I started putting little post-its at the intersection. So this happened in Pakistan in this year, and this happened in this decade, and this happened in Iraq in that decade. And slowly you could see the trend lines emerge. You could suddenly realize that, at the same time as in Lebanon, Iran was sending revolutionary guards to set up a base in the Bekaa Valley and start the formation of Hezbollah. And women were feeling that they had to wear the all-enveloping black chador. And, there was new programming on the radio. And it was, Baalbek, that town in eastern Lebanon where they set up base, was being called Little Tehran. At the same time, in Pakistan, the jihad against the Soviets was in full swing across the border in Afghanistan, and Peshawar was being used as a base by the Mujahideen, and the Saudis were pumping it full of money, and it was being called Little Arabistan. Yeah. And the same trend lines, the rise of religion, the rise of new programming on the radio, different types of sermons. So that was the sort of the logistical process. And then I spent a very long time trying to write the outline. And I remember my agent saying, "Kim, just start writing. You're going to miss your deadline." And I said, "No, I have to figure out where all the pieces of the puzzle go in the structure." And then I could start writing.
It must have been a big wall with a lot of post-its.
It was big. Yeah, I took a picture of it before I brought it down.
So let me just ask you a pretty basic question. You say in the book, and this is a quote, "Today's headlines are not a reflection of who we are. They never were." And I'm wondering, what is the biggest misconception that we in the West have about this region, in a nutshell? And obviously, if you read the book, you just will be so vastly better educated about all the forces at work there and why certain things have happened that seem completely odd and strange to us, that have a kind of weird coherence to them once you kind of know the history and these roots that you're talking about. But what is the biggest misconception that we have?
Can I give you three?
You can give me. I'm sure that's a short list.
No, it's really three, and they're the ones that I address in the book, and it's the three key misconceptions that I think people have in the West, and not just in the West, probably elsewhere outside of the Middle East. First of all, Saudi Arabia and Iran were not always rivals. So before 1979, they were friendly competitors or allied rivals in a way. They were twin pillars in the US policy to contain the Soviet Union in the Middle East. They exchanged visits between kings and, called each other with endearing terms. So that's one. And my take is, if they could be friends before, and they had several episodes of détente since 1979 even, it is not impossible to see them having a détente again or a rapprochement. So that's one. Second, when American officials, including President Obama, say things like Sunnis and Shias have always killed each other, it'll always be like that. There's a problem with that statement because it's wrong. And the reason why it's a problem when you make that statement is because it sort of gives you a way out as America or as any country that is trying to have an influence in the region. It's always be like that. We can't do anything about it. But it's wrong, and it's unfair to the region, and it's unfair to Sunnis and Shias, because the paroxysm of sectarian violence that you see today in the region is really a modern phenomena. It's really the last 40 years, and it became worse after 2003 and the US invasion of Iraq. But over the course of Islam's history, Sunnis and Shias have not killed each other more, and they probably killed each other less than Protestants and Catholics. It's just that today, in the last few decades, it is at its height. Well, and so it's the headlins and the news and everything.
I want you to get to the third one, but just because I may forget to ask you this, but there's an enormously interesting part of the book is about the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and Mecca as a place of diverse interpretations, diverse adherences to Islam over history, that becomes a flashpoint for what you're talking about. Isn't that one example?
Well, it used to be a place of very diverse teachings, where all the four schools of Islam were being taught. Now, so 1979 is a turning point, and that's when the third reason that the third misconception comes in, which is that after 1979, the tolerance, the vibrancy, the coexistence is shattered after 1979, and so the region becomes a lot more intolerant, a lot more tense in various ways, and culture changes, even outward looks change. But what I want to make clear is that before 1979, even though I do make the argument that across the region it was much more diverse and tolerant and full of vibrant culture, and it still is to this day, the Saudi kingdom was always very conservative. It was always very conservative, especially in the interior desert areas, the Najd areas from where the Al Sauds hail. You had a much more progressive, tolerant understanding of Islam in the Hijaz province, which is on the Red Sea and which is home to Mecca and Medina. But when the Al Sauds became the rulers of Saudi Arabia, they tried to impose their understanding of Islam, which is often referred to as Wahhabism, on the rest of the kingdom. They were not that successful. The Hijaz kept, trying to maintain its diversity and its tolerance and its teachings of various schools of Islam. 1979 put an end to that. The Saudis felt undermined and challenged in their role as custodians of the two holy sites, and instead of going the way of more tolerance and trying to bring the country forward, they clamped down and they stopped all teachings that were not part of their puritanical brand of Islam.
They even started publishing their own versions of the Quran.
Correct.
Right,
yes.
and distributing those by the millions. So in doing this book and doing all this research and travel and immersing yourself in this, did any of your own conceptions change? Did you have misconceptions? Did anything surprise you in particular?
You know, what surprised me is the extent to which 1979 was, in fact, really a turning point. I was surprised by some of the gems that I found in my research, or that my research assistants dug up, you know, spending hours in the libraries. Just if you just look at the newspaper headlines of the time and compare them to today, it's incredible. I mean, we came across this one headline from February 1979 when Khomeini is victorious in Tehran, and the Saudis have this, you know, praise for the success of the revolution. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I knew that they were allies before, but I didn't expect that they would praise the revolution, because they thought, well, you know, the Shah was a friend, but he's gone. The people have spoken. Okay. And hey, here's a guy who looks a little bit more like us and who's all about religion and wants to use the Quran as the constitution of the country. We understand that. We can relate. But what they didn't know is that, you know, Khomeini had his own ideas about who his friends were, and the Saudis were not among that. And he also had grand designs to become leader of the whole Muslim world and not just Iran, and that threatened the Saudis. The other thing that I found, which I found very interesting and that I had not thought of at all, was when did it really begin, the sectarian killing? Where was the ground zero? And actually it was in Pakistan. It was in Pakistan in a very specific incident that was connected to the jihad in Afghanistan, where Zia al-Haq, the dictator who was backed by the United States at the time, had, you know, he was, his hold on power was tenuous, but it was consolidated by the fact that he was the key his country was the key staging post for the jihad. And so suddenly he was the West's darling, flush with money, American, Saudi support, etc.
Right.
And he wanted to make sure he could maintain that, because he was coming under regular pressure within the country, women protesting, men protesting. I mean, the challenges against him were huge. And he wanted to make sure he could maintain his country as a staging post for the jihad. And militants were traveling from the border areas in Pakistan into Afghanistan. And the Soviets were shelling back. And they were shelling villages that were, it so happened by the fate of geography, predominantly Shia. And those villages wanted to stop the militants from crossing through their towns into Afghanistan.
Right.
The militants, the Mujahideen, were Sunni.
Right.
And so to make sure that the Shia villagers don't interdict the transit of Mujahideen, he sends a sectarian militia that he's just created to kill the Shias.
Yeah.
And then the violence starts, and it mingles with the jihad in Afghanistan, and the Saudis use that to their advantage, and it becomes the starting point of what we're seeing today.
I'm going to skip ahead to something I was going to ask you a little bit later, but just because you mentioned this in Peshawar, and I need to try to find this, but you say, if Beirut was the supermarket of the left in the 1970s, where Marxists, communists, Egyptians, and Iraqis, and all the Palestinian factions debated and theorized, published and drank in bars, arguing over ideas, and then fought in the streets, Peshawar was the supermarket of the Islamists in the 1980s without the drinking.
There was some drinking going on in speakeasies. One of which was right next door to where Osama bin Laden set up.
I was going to say, Osama bin Laden is in Peshawar. The Saudis are funneling all this money.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
and Jamal Khashoggi is at Peshawar as a journalist.
Right. And
it was Jamal who gave me that line.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was Jamal who gave me that line. Jamal was a friend.
Yes,
and
I was going to ask you about him too.
I spoke to him a lot for the book. And he gave me that line because he was witnessing it firsthand.
And at that point, he was, I believe,
a reporter.
Reporting for a Saudi newspaper, and
Arab News and
Awqas. And he was fairly conventional, fairly conservative.
He was, because these were the years when Islam, which had not beforehand been a political force anywhere in the region, was starting to become one, because in the Sunni world, and that's how the Iran Revolution rippled out of Iran, in the Sunni world, where young men and women who wanted more religion in their lives, but were still, as a force, very marginal in their societies, whether in Egypt or in Syria or in Iraq, looked to Iran and were inspired by what the Iranians had achieved in their country and were trying to emulate that,
Right.
but were unsuccessful. I mean, the assassination of Anwar Sadat was meant to produce an Islamic revolution
In Egypt, which it could not.
But it could not, because the country was not ready for that. The society didn't want that.
Right.
And there was no one like Khomeini to lead it to that fruition, because the Iranian Revolution was not meant to be an Islamic revolution at the outset. But in Peshawar, all these young men coming from these different countries, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, met there, and developed a camaraderie and learned about the power of the gun, and then took these ideas and skills back to their countries.
Exactly. Yeah, the number of instances in which disenfranchised or demoralized, marginalized people who have been exiled or left for nothing in their respective countries, and they go elsewhere and find solidarity is quite striking, and it does make you wonder about a lot of things happening in this country today with people who are being excluded and marginalized as well. Anyway, so getting back to 1979, so one of the things that I came away with, and I hope this is what you intended, is that if you look at the most powerful forces at work in the Middle East today, suppression of popular movements in Iran and Egypt and elsewhere, the longevity and brutality of the Assads, especially this current one, the Saudi war in Yemen, that these are rooted in what now seems like, even if it wasn't pre-1979, a really intractable rivalry between these two countries, these two powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran. But you say in the book that rivalry is less about theology than the pure pursuit of power. And you write, that 79 was the flashpoint. You say there were two revolutions, one that made headlines and one that unfurled quietly, a black wave with far-reaching consequences for millions. And the black wave, of course, is the title of the book, and you also use that term elsewhere in the book. And I'm wondering, just for sake of people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, if you could explain your choice of that title.
So in the 90s, the Egyptian movie director Youssef Chahine used that term, and I quote him in the book, and it's the title of the chapter on Egypt in the 90s, and it became the title of the book. Black wave, in his mind, was what he described the black wave that he thought was coming from the Gulf, specifically from Saudi Arabia, where the money was starting to flow into countries like Egypt from the kingdom to try to tweak and change the way people understood their religion, the way they prayed, what was being preached in the mosques, and how women dressed. And so in this rivalry that erupts after 1979 between Saudi Arabia and Iran, these two countries don't just deploy the geopolitical tools at their disposal to fight for supremacy in the region, but they use religion, culture to rally people to their side. And the Saudis do it in mostly Sunni countries and Sunni communities, and they flood Egypt with money. Journalists are hired to write for Saudi-funded newspapers and write laudatory articles, or certainly articles that don't cross certain red lines. And so Saudi Arabia gets very favorable coverage. There's also money that reportedly goes to the veiling of women.
I was going to say actresses in particular, right?
Actresses in particular, who start a trend. We all have, if you've lived in the Middle East or know enough about Middle East culture, you remember these beautiful movies from the 60s and 70s with these, Egyptian actresses who are dressed in the latest fashion. And the movies are really, they're stunning. I mean, they're absolutely stunning. They're Hollywood level. But in the 90s, with the Saudi money coming in, you see Egyptian actresses travel to Saudi Arabia and come back with the full face veil, the niqab, or the black abaya, and they start spreading it around them. They start trying to convert other women. And there's a joke at the time in Egypt that goes, who are the second best paid women in the country? It's the belly dancers, because the Saudi sheikhs put money directly in the belt of their skirt. But who are the best paid women in Egypt? The belly dancers who've adopted the veil, because the Saudi sheikhs put the money directly in their bank account.
And some of them felt they had no choice, right? I mean, their careers depended on it.
In some ways, possibly, yes. They felt that, if this is what the Saudi market demanded, because the Saudis also started television stations, it was the beginning of satellite broadcasting, that if this is what the Saudi market now demanded, because the Saudis were perfectly happy watching, the Egyptian women in their low-cut dresses before, but the mood had changed in the kingdom as well, and they wanted to have these outwardly signs of piety. And the black wave is so it's the niqab and the face veil, and in parallel, mirroring that, is the black all-enveloping chador that Iran starts exporting to Shia communities, including in Lebanon. And then the black wave continues with the use of the black flags of these, militant groups like ISIS more recently, but also the black flags of mourning for Imam Hussein, the most revered Imam in Shia Islam, which, spreads all over South Lebanon, when that wasn't how people expressed their piety before. And then, if you want to take it more further metaphorically, is the black wave that, engulfed us in just darkness.
Darkness, yeah. Speaking of the veil, and I mean this with all respect, but it's almost a minor character in your book. And you say at one point, that the veil, as you've just described, becomes ubiquitous in this period. And it is, you say, the new chic, a status symbol for the reasons you just mentioned. But there is pushback. But there is pushback.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was the new chic because it meant that you had, gone to Saudi Arabia, the land of oil, the land of God. Surely the Saudis must have it right, because not only were they the home of the two holy sites in Islam, but they'd been in, God had given them all this oil and all these riches. So they must have, they must be, doing it right. And so it was the new chic to emulate that style of dressing, whereas before the new chic was whatever styles you got in Paris. I don't make a big deal out of the veil, and I didn't want the book to become all about women being wearing the veil, because at the end of the day it's also a personal choice. And I have a lot of friends who are very progressive in their outlook who are veiled, and there is no contradiction there.
I think the point comes through that the issue is really choice, not should or shouldn't.
In some cases it's choice, and in some cases it's peer pressure, and in some cases it's family pressure. But there was a lot of pushback at the beginning in a lot of places, like Pakistan, where Zia al-Haq, in his desire to be also the most righteous Muslim leader, beats Khomeini to the declaration of Islamic law as the as a law that will from now on rule the country. So Khomeini comes back from Paris, lands in Tehran, and within a week declares an Islamic that the Quran will be the constitution as of now. Islamic law is imposed on February 11th, but the day before, on February 10th, Zia al-Haq declares that Islamic law will now rule the country, and he's very proud to say that he gloats about the fact that he was ahead of Khomeini in doing that.
Right. Moving on from the veil, though, to a more centrally important point is the role of women. Women who have so often been points of resistance, points of protest, organizers, community activists, and you say they feel the brunt of the changes over this period. What is it about women in this region that has generated such a tremendous amount of courage and bravery in response, would you say?
We're feisty. We're feisty.
Must be it.
And in Pakistan especially, I think, going back to the question about what surprised me most or what shattered my misconceptions, I mean, Pakistan was really, I love that country. I really love that country, and it's where I learned the most about how much had changed. Because even I thought, oh my God, Pakistan's always been like that. But it wasn't always like that. And it still isn't, this sort of monolith of extremism and fundamentalism that most people assume it is. I mean, you go there and the culture, the music, it's in their DNA, the dancing, the poetry, it's incredible. And it's a shame that we don't know more about it. But the women in Pakistan really fight back hard against Zia al-Haq's efforts to Islamize the country in ways that it had never been before.
Well, he
And they
Islamized-
protest on the streets and they burn their veils. I mean, burning of the bra. They really actually did burn their veils in protest. When he decided that, when he tried to order that they were not allowed to wear makeup on television as anchors, they said, well, we're not doing it. We're not going on television without our makeup. He wanted to impose the veil, and one of them said, no, I quit. There was a lot of that. And it's a shame, going back to, the misconceptions, that kind of stuff didn't get covered because the coverage was all about Zia al-Haq and the fight against the Soviets, and that dominated. And in a way, in the Western coverage, no one, I think, really cared about the local dynamics and what the local people were having to deal with with this dictator who was Western backed, because, it wasn't important in the face of the greater fight against the Soviet Union.
Well, and you make the point that in his case, not to dwell on him throughout this program, but that he was really also what was so different about him was the moving away from Muslim inclusion, right? I mean, he became a much sort of narrow version of Islamization.
Yes, I mean, Pakistan is a very diverse country, and it has huge minority.
It was founded as such.
Yes, and it has a huge minority that is Shia. It's the largest Shia population outside of Iran, 35% of the country. And when he imposed Islamic law as, the rule of the land, he was in essence Sunnifying the country because he imposed a Sunni interpretation. And he did that with the help of the Saudis and Saudi money.
Right.
And it sort of started these cleavages within society where people started looking at each other in terms of Sunni and Shia in a way that had not happened before. And then you have the events of the 80s where he sends these sectarian militias, and you have more sectarian militias. And today, Sunni Shia violence in Pakistan is terrible. But again, it was never like that before.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many names of figures in this book that we all know from reading the news over the last 40 years, if we're that old. And Khomeini, Zia, Arafat, Assad, Bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, Mohammed bin Salman more recently, and many others. But I think that really among the most interesting people that you talk about are the people, at least I, by the way, am not an expert, so maybe many of you have heard of some of them. Many people I had not heard of who are in some ways critical actors in laying the foundation for a lot of what you describe goes on, and in other cases, heroes of resistance, heroes of courage, and trying to fight back against certain kinds of suppressive tendencies and even state-sanctioned violence. I'm wondering if you could talk for a minute about, maybe let's start with Fuad Ahmed Nehm, who is a poet and was also an early supporter of the Iranian Revolution and then evolved from there.
The Egyptian poet. Yeah. So because, there was such admiration for what the Iranians had achieved in overthrowing the despot, the Egyptian poet wrote a poem welcoming the revolution, good morning Tehran, and predicting that Sadat would be next, because at the time President Sadat was president and he would later be assassinated. And he then realized that the revolution in Iran wasn't quite what he expected it to be and what a lot of Iranians had expected it to be. He spends a lot of years in and out of jail. And then in 2011, with the Arab uprisings and the uprising in Egypt that overthrows Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian poet thinks that perhaps this is the revolution that is going to bring us the democracy that we dreamt of in 1979, but failed to appear. And his words are the words of his poems are scribbled on the walls again of Tahrir Square and of Cairo, and unfortunately, it doesn't quite play out the right way.
There are so many, and by the way, if you have a question, start making your way to the microphone. I realize I'm going on way too long here, but we really want to hear your questions. There are so many strange bedfellows. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are just these alliances and loyalties and allegiances that seem at once purely opportunistic and expedient.
Like the leftists and Khomeini.
Well,
the secular
I was going to say the
leftists.
leftists. Well, this made me think of the leftists and Khomeini. And so often these conflicts and tensions are framed as the West versus Islam. or nationalism versus religious fundamentalism, or expansionism versus constraint. But at various different points, they will shift.
Because it's always about power.
Yeah.
It's always about power. It's who can be my friend in this, situation that can help me move forward. Who can help me with that? And that's why, going back to your earlier question, I mean, the Saudi-Iran rivalry is really about power. It's about hegemony. It's about supremacy in the region. And, when you look at some of the strange bedfellows, you could, look at, for example, Hezbollah, Shia militant group allied to Iran, and Hamas, Sunni Palestinian group. And so you think, well, Sunni, Shia, how does that work? Well, it works because, they have, a common vision of the world that is, that brings them together. And so that alliance is possible. There are loads of those, crossovers.
Qassem Soleimani, who we've all read about, obviously. And I think it's probably fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that we think of him here as a terrorist whose main preoccupation was Israel and the West. But in fact, he was also preoccupied with ISIS.
Yes, he was. I mean, he, that's
another strange.
Well, he was preoccupied with stopping the rise of ISIS.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. So it's not strange in the sense that ISIS is, as I call it in the book, the rebel child of Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. It is a manifestation of the trends that they have fed over the years with their intolerant teachings. Mm-hmm. And they are very anti-Shia. Mm-hmm. And so they see Iran as an enemy. So it's not strange that Qassem Soleimani should want to counter them. But that I think is a whole different discussion about how some of what Iran and Syria, President Assad did also helped the rise of ISIS because it suited them to say it's either me, President Assad, or ISIS. You pick in talking to the West. And that is often what dictators do in the Middle East. They feed some of these trends. Hosni Mubarak did it in Egypt, even though he was an ally of the US. It's either the fundamentalists or us. I do want to make one point. The book is very much about the local actors and the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because I wanted to go beyond it's all about the West and it's all America's fault, and I wanted to go beyond the Islam versus the West or the Middle East versus the West. It's not all about that. There are local actors who have agency. They're Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they have done a lot of damage to the region in their pursuit of power.
And through proxies.
Through proxies. But I don't absolve the United States either, because the United States gets involved at various critical points and overthrows people or invades countries, and that aggravates the dynamics or provokes new dynamics. But my focus is very much on the responsibility of the local actors as well.
Well, I think that what comes through in the book is that the United States certainly either misinterprets or downplays the significance
of certain
for
events.
Example, of Khomeini. Yeah. Or of
well, yes, they were hoping, because they were so concerned about all the leftists and the communists and the Marxists around him, that they were worried, as were the Saudis initially, that there would be a Soviet takeover of Iran. So they're looking at Khomeini as a force that could temper the ardors of the leftists initially. That was the CIA assessment.
Well, and we all know that our initial reaction to Mohammed bin Salman was, glowing and favorable, and that has not turned out so well.
Some people are still full of praise for him.
That's true. Ma'am, you have a question.
Sure, I just wanted for it to get started. The Arab Springs, it seemed so hopeful at the time. We were all focused on Tahrir Square and the social media stuff that they were sending out. And it didn't really succeed anywhere. Why didn't they do better?
3 reasons. 1, the Saudis and the Iranians got involved. They were both reliving 1979 as they watched what was happening in Egypt. The Saudis were afraid that it was a repeat of what they had seen with the Shah, so they decided to do everything they could to stop that. The Iranians thought that this was their moment to recapture the hope, in their view, of 1979, because when Sadat was assassinated, it did not lead to an Islamic revolution, so they thought maybe if Mubarak is removed, it will lead to an Islamic awakening, and they described it in that way. So the Saudis got involved with the Emiratis to try to counter the rise of the natural maturation, the political maturation of what was going on in Egypt, and that gave us Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And I think, the United States took its eyes off the ball and then decided that actually what they really wanted was stability instead of continued upheaval. These are long processes. When you've been living under a dictator for 30 years, as Egypt
Or more.
or more, it's not overnight. It's not that we're not capable of bringing democracy to our countries or having stable government. It's just that it takes time when all you've known is dictatorship. It's not an overnight exercise. It wasn't an overnight exercise in the United States or in Europe either. So revolutions take time, but it's not helped by outside interference where everyone has an agenda. And the American desire for almost obsessive quest for stability in the region has been very detrimental to the political maturation of the region, because you keep a lid on everything for the sake of stability.
Speaking of which, more recently than the situation in Egypt that she's referring to, there were protests in Syria. There appeared to be the chance for, it was fairly close to an overthrow of Assad. It didn't work.
Except because we know now that the Iranians were involved very, very early on. Qasem Soleimani in person went to Syria in 2011 to see how he could help President Assad make sure that this peaceful uprising would not bring him down.
And I should say that, there's been a lot of discussion here about the red line, Obama's red line and chemical weapons, and then there being no consequence to that, which do you think that did embolden Assad? To use the level of violence against his own people is really ultimately what crushed any possibility of a popular overthrow, no?
Yes, there was a sense that the United States had ceded the region to Iran, Russia. And I think that interpretation, I would have to agree with it. The Russians saw an opportunity, the Iranians were already there, and they took over. It's fine to say we don't want to be involved in the Middle East anymore. It's fine to say we want to withdraw all the troops, we don't want to be involved in wars anymore. That's a fine position to take if you believe in it. But it comes with consequences. Mm-hmm. It's not, if you want to be a superpower, you have to be invested in all these different issues. You cannot pick and choose. Mm-hmm. And President Obama, I think, wanted to pick and choose, or perhaps believe that America's power had more staying power, that even if he wasn't involved, hands-on, that America's, that the longevity of American influence would remain. Mm-hmm. But other actors are very fast at filling the void.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Hi, Kim. Eric Thompson. Two parts of my question is, and following up on the previous question, in regards to the Arab Spring, how do you view the Tunisia and their reaction and their progress in regards to that? And secondly, you spoke about that this is a matter of power, but constantly I'm reading studies that says that religion, both here in the United States and around the world, is, as far as participation, is decreasing, and even in the Arab world as well. So does that imply that there's going to be less secular strife between the Sunnis and the Shias, or is it still just a matter of power, and that's going to keep that violence going?
It's a great question, because young people in the region are fed up with religion, and you see it in their behavior. You see it in the polls. They feel that religion has too much influence in their daily life, and that's why the Saudis and the Iranians have decided, the Saudi leadership and the Iranian leadership are starting to use nationalism as the new rallying cry. And isn't that, the fashion around the world today? So that's one. Going back to the Tunisia question, I'm not a Tunisia expert, but what I can say is that they've been the most successful at their uprising. It's hard, but they're being, in a way, left alone, because there are no geopolitical interests there for anyone, not for America really, not for the Saudis, not for the Iranians. They're kind of being left to go through this process on their own. And they're being quite successful. They're being quite successful also at empowering women, having a new constitution, equal rights, and trying to curtail the role of religion and absorb the threat of fundamentalism. Because strangely enough, although Tunisia was such a success of the Arab uprisings, the number of recruits in ISIS, the largest number were Tunisians. And that's an interesting contradiction. But they're managing this process very well, mostly because everyone's leaving them alone.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Kim, from Pakistan, and you're spot on about your assessment there. I was just interested in your assessment of Lebanon. I mean, I was there a few months ago, and I was really struck by on the ground, like, the Iran effect, right? Little Tehran in neighborhoods, the Hezbollah posters all over the place. So how did you find, how does this book relate to what's happening in Lebanon today? And how was it different, like, living there and covering it? How does this relate to that?
So the book ends in 2019, or early 2019, end of 2018, with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. It's not a spoiler, for the book. Everyone knows how it ends. It's like the Titanic, but you still want to read, the whole story and travel through, what I describe as the 1001 nights of modern Arab geopolitics, Middle Eastern geopolitics. What's happening in Lebanon today with the protests, I mean, it doesn't get much coverage in the US, but over the last 100 days, the Lebanese have been protesting against the corrupt leadership, the establishment, the leadership that has really sunk the country into terrible debt and bringing us close to bankruptcy. And again, Iran and Saudi Arabia, but mostly Iran, are players in this, because it's again about who will gain the upper hand in that country, because Saudi Arabia has interests and Iran has, of course, its interests and its ally in the form of Hezbollah, the militant group. And you're right to say that it looks more and more like Iran is playing a role in that, because Qasem Soleimani, when he was killed, was coming back from Beirut. He'd just been there, and now on the airport road you see all these posters of the road leading from the airport to Beirut. You see all these posters of Qasem Soleimani. It's a long discussion about what's really happening in Lebanon and how these protests are also happening in Iraq. Young Iraqis protesting against Iran's stranglehold on the politics of their country, how Iran is, taking out all the resources of the country for its own purposes. I think two things. Iran realizes that it's being challenged, but it's also using that moment to try to turn it into a victory, because they are always, those parties, those players that are willing to use violence to gain control often come on top, because they face opponents and critics who are more, less willing to use violence, unfortunately. I'm not calling for violence on all sides, but it's a tough fight, and it means that you have to stand your ground as a protesters and go back to the square when your tents are destroyed, when your symbols are put on fire. You have to have the courage and the resilience and the staying power to come back. But I do think that, in Iraq and in Lebanon, people are fed up with the leadership and the establishment, and Hezbollah has become part of the establishment. So I don't think these protests are going away, but I can't predict where they will eventually lead to.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your work. I learned so much from it. I wanted to ask, and this isn't just because of what happened with Soleimani, but we hear a lot of discussion about Iranian government, and I wanted to ask you about the Iranian people, especially as a very young country, very well-educated country. There were huge protests in December against the government that unfortunately got forgotten about as soon as the Soleimani episode happened.
They came back.
And they came back after the downing of the plane. But I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the future of a country with a people that are seemingly very desperate for change, the likelihood of change, and where you see the culture of a very, what once we used to call a progressive and Western-loving country, and I think still has many strands of the progressive and advanced kind of culture that sometimes the news doesn't pay attention to now. Where do you see it going, and where do you see the people of Iran pushing towards something that may be beyond the government that we know of today?
It's very hard to predict, because, in 1978, when Iranians were protesting against the Shah, no one could really tell whether they were going to be successful, what would be the outcome. And it's only in hindsight that we realize that one particular incident with the burning down of a cinema was the turning point, the galvanizing point. A lot of people think that the downing of the Ukrainian plane and the way the authorities handled it is the turning point. We won't be able to know and for a while. I do think that the protest, that Iran is in a constant state of protest right now. There are several hundred protests taking place in various parts of the country every week. And it's been like this since 2017, and I don't think it's going away. Unfortunately, as one Iranian friend told me, the regime still has a lot of killing in it. So they're willing to use violence to suppress these protests. And that's very unfortunate. But when you look at the perseverance of the protesters, when you look at the women who are protesting the mandatory veil, including women who want to stay veiled but want women to have the choice, that is almost like a war of attrition that is taking place across the country. Again, it doesn't get much coverage, but women are taking to the streets alone or in small numbers, sometimes with their fathers, brothers, who film them walking on the street without the veil, and that is in defiance of the law. And they get harassed by the morality police, they get harassed by other women who wear the veil, but they're not giving up, and that has been ongoing for 2-3 years now. So I see this trend continuing, but I won't speculate on where it leads to.
Two quick questions. First, could you put the assault on Mecca in context? I can't remember if it occurred just before the Iranian Revolution or just after, but surely that shaped Saudi reactions internally and also externally. And the second question is, your talk about sectarianism in Islam, I thought about Lebanon and the fact that Lebanon has this crazy constitution that allocates political power among religious groups. Specifically, the Speaker of the Parliament is a Shia, the President is a Christian, and the Prime Minister is a Sunni.
It works most of the time.
But surely that represents a durable sectarian nature that transcends and precedes 1979.
Yes, because that was the Constitution, before it was enshrined in the Constitution, it was a gentleman's agreement after Lebanon's independence. But when I talk about sectarianism, I talk specifically about the Sunni Shia violence that we're seeing today and the rise of that, the weaponization of the Sunni Shia divide. In Lebanon, the constitution is the way it is to, in essence, protect, I guess, the rights of every community and give them a share of the power. But the goal eventually is to get rid of that. But I just don't think that we're in that process yet. Going back to your first question, yes, 1979, the siege of the Holy Mosque in Mecca happened in November of that year. So in February, you had the Iranian Revolution. In February, the revolution in Iran. In November, the siege against the Holy Mosque in Mecca. And in December, the invasion of Afghanistan. The siege of the Holy Mosque in Mecca by Saudi Sunni zealots was very scary for the Saudis because it challenged their role as custodians of the two holy sites. People were asking questions. I mean, if you can't keep the two mosques safe, the holy sites safe, what exactly is your role? And it pushed them to get involved in the jihad in Afghanistan as a way to, reburnish their credentials as leaders of the Muslim world, to fund and support this good war, because it was seen as the good war, to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Thanks.
One more question
Great.
before I end it.
Great. It's a two-part question. So, Kim, thank you so much. I look forward to reading your book. As an Arab American, I have a very different answer to, hey, do you have a neighbor that went to Afghanistan? My question to the question, do you have a neighbor who went to Afghanistan? Right. My question generally is, in your research and in your, I'm not sure if you touch on this in your book, how have you seen the black wave affect Western Muslims, American Muslims, Muslims in Europe. Speaking from personal experience, I know how much that it's penetrated the socio-political fabric of our community. The other side of the other question is, speaking of bedfellows, those of us who are calling for a more restrained and responsible foreign policy on behalf of the U.S. Have a tough time, some seem to have a tough time articulating a vision that doesn't shovel the driveway of dictatorships and brutal regimes. So I was wondering if you could touch on that, particularly in this political moment. Thank you.
Shovel the driveways of dictators and regimes. Can I use that line?
Sure.
I'll credit you. On the first question, I haven't looked at it in details because that would have been a whole different book. But we know how much the Iranians and the Saudis are spending on proselytizing beyond their borders, beyond the region, all the way to India and to Africa, trying to convert Sunnis to become Shias, funding mosques with a specific outlook in India. They spend millions, including Iran, which is under sanctions, which is struggling at home. So the black wave extends beyond the border and into Europe as well. And the Saudis, that's a whole different area of research, and I couldn't tackle all of that. Because when you write a narrative like this and you're trying to weave in and out of countries and eras and use characters to anchor your narrative, you can't, the book is chronological.
It's very much tethered to chronology.
Yeah, it's tethered to chronology and to the characters and to the countries and time and place and descriptions, and it's full of literature and poetry and lyrics of songs. And so I couldn't then start writing about, even unfortunately Yemen is not really included in the book aside from a small reference. I couldn't start writing about these proselytizing efforts outside of the region because it was just going to be too much. In terms of, a foreign policy that is more restrained, I think, it requires more restrained but more thoughtful, and that doesn't, do the bidding of dictators. I think it requires first a long, hard think about whether stability at all cost in the Middle East really serves America's interest in the long term. I think it doesn't. I think the conclusion is clear. But how do you get out of that? I think it requires a willingness to accept that the region is not as we think it is, and perhaps all the candidates want to read my book.
Maybe the president should read your book. Maybe the president should read any book.
So I think that it requires a deeper understanding of the region beyond the headlines. It requires an acceptance of the fact that there are a lot of misconceptions about the region. And it requires a policy that is not short-term. And I know that's hard because, presidential cycles run in 4-year terms. But it requires a little bit of planning and thinking beyond a 4-year, and to establish a new understanding of what America's interests are in the Middle East and why they are more than just oil and dictators. I know that's not a very detailed, satisfactory answer, but I'll try to work on an article that provides some beginnings of thought of what that foreign policy could look like. Thank you.
I am going to take the opportunity to ask one last question. I do want to remind you all that Kim's book is up front. If you would like to get a copy, she'll sign it here. The signing line will start there and move this way. But the last question, you say in your conclusion of the book, you say that working on it, you alternated between hope and despair. And you sort of decided, or I don't know if you decided, but you ended on hope. Can you just give us the hopeful tone of the author who's been through this process of writing this amazing book?
It's the people. It's really the people who give you hope. When you travel to Pakistan and you meet these feisty women who have not given up and who, give you a piece of their mind about how they want their country to be. The hope is when Asya Bibi, the Christian woman who was accused of blasphemy and jailed, who was defended by a Muslim governor who was then assassinated for his role in defending her, because defending a blasphemous woman makes you a blasphemer. When she was finally acquitted, the governor's family took a lot of hope from that. They felt that there was a trend that was, receding. When I speak to, Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, a Syrian intellectual who spent years in Assad's jails, whose wife was kidnapped and, has still not reappeared, kidnapped by militants during the uprising, militants funded to some extent by Saudi Arabia. And he is still holding on and writing and raising his voice and publishing books. How can I feel, hopeless, right? You have to keep going. And when I see Iranians protesting their government and Iraqis defying the militias and taking to the streets, when I see musicians producing incredible work, movie makers producing incredible documentaries, and Nadine Labaki, one of a fellow Lebanese, produced this incredible movie Capernaum that was, I believe, nominated for the Oscars. I mean, this is still such a vibrant region if we could just look beyond the headlines about terrorists and tyrants. And that's where you get the hope from, because if you lose hope, there's really no point in living. And if my family and I had lost hope during the civil war in Lebanon, we would have just, buried ourselves alive. And the hope is because there is only one way, and it's forward.
Kim, it is a great book. I hope you all will read it. Give it to people. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for being here.
There's no way I could do it justice. So you actually have to read the whole book, start to finish, and you will be richly rewarded. Thank you.